Госпожа председатель.
Madam President, I wanted to say a few words on a point of order. We are in a room that is full. The room is not only full, but the list of speakers who are not members of the Security Council who call themselves ministers of foreign affairs of European countries. The European Union, except for for a few exclusions, does not have an independent foreign policy. There are no ministers of foreign affairs. There are simply officials who claim that they are foreign ministers. Foreign policy is in the hands of Brussels, while Brussels is in the hands of Washington. So maybe you can answer a rhetorical question. What is the added value? What is the added value of statements by officials that were written under dictation, other than an opportunity to show themselves off on the television of their countries while stating their unconditional, unstinting support for their Kiev clients? In New York, we have a representative of the EU with the UN. He could have spoken on behalf of everyone. The EU has a common foreign policy and common security policy. What could you possibly add to that? Maybe you can tell us about the weapons that you're supplying to the criminal Kiev regime, which it uses not to target military facilities, but rather peaceful civilians in Russian cities. And the representative of the United Kingdom could tell us maybe how his former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, dissuaded the Kiev authorities to conclude an agreement in April 2022 that had already been initialed, an agreement with Russia, thus encouraging Kiev to continue fighting and condemning to death tens of thousands of Ukrainians who were then thrown into the front as cannon fodder. And by the way, where were all of you yesterday when the Council yesterday was discussing the Middle Eastern peace process and the situation in Gaza? Where was the Secretary General? I just want to remind everyone that not a single European Union country, and in fact not a single Western country, not a single time put forward an initiative to convene even just one meeting on Gaza. In Gaza, the number of victims among the civilian population as a result of blatant violations of international humanitarian law by Israel over the past 4.5 months, most of them are women and children, has far exceeded the numbers of military conflicts that have occurred over the past few years. This is more than eloquently speaks to your hypocrisy and double standards. I want to warn you in advance that I don't intend to listen to the ritual mantras of representatives of European states. They can practice their eloquence in front of each other, clogging the airwaves with their hypocritical statements. Thank you, Madam President. Today's meeting, convened at the initiative of a number of Western states, is like déjà vu. A year ago in the same room, the Maltese presidency to mark the one-year anniversary of our special military operation, where foreign ministers were brought together to read anti-Russian statement that was copied under dictation. A year ago, the Western Bloc was very much tried to promote its peaceful initiatives, which in essence were reduced to the cunning statement from Orwell, war is peace. At the same time, the West openly instilled in Zelensky, who was no rocket scientist when it comes to strategic thinking, the absurd illusion that with Western support he could defeat Russia on the field of battle. In particular, certain gentlemen from the wonderful garden tried very hard, for whom anyone who was not part of the golden billion are trash. The European Union also, following Orwell, continued to supply weapons to the Kiev regime using the money from the Peace Fund. Another year has passed since then. Ukraine has completely failed in its loudly broadcast counteroffensive, and yet the West continues to pump the Kiev regime full of weaponry, encouraging it to throw more and more lives of Ukrainians in the flame of conflict, which the United States, already setting aside any decorum, now calls a profitable business venture. In fact, that's because it's become so profitable for the military-industrial complex. In parallel, there was a stubborn attempt to promote some kind of process to discuss some kind of completely dead-end pseudo-peace formula at different meetups, where either in Copenhagen or in Davos, using various tricks, countries from the global south and east were dragged into these events in order to then present this as broad international support. At the same time, it is clear that the countries of the global majority clearly see the real background of these intrigues and have no wish to play the role of extras in them, just as they understand that it's completely pointless to discuss anything without the participation of Russia. So what has this year brought for Ukraine? Hundreds of thousands senseless victims, a looming collapse of its economy, a deep crisis of its statehood and governance. Because for the people of Ukraine, it's increasingly clear how ineffective and how the ineffective its government and how much it lacks independence. Wallowing in corruption, this government cannot even meet its basic social obligations, while it badgers Western donors without success for money to even pay their pensions to its citizens. The younger generation, and now already not so young generation, is being nabbed on the streets like animals and then are thrown into meat grinder assaults in order to show to Western sponsors that their investments are bringing returns. Today we heard, and we will hear, many pompous statements. However, in fact, the West is not interested at all in helping the Ukraine. The essence of Western policy towards Ukraine was recently summarized by the editor-in-chief of The Economist, Zeni Minton-Bedouis. She claimed in a television interview, and here I quote, "Giving money to the Ukraine is the cheapest way for the United States to strengthen its security. The Ukrainians are fighting. They're being killed. The United States and Europe are simply supplying them with weapons, and by doing this, we are pushing back against Putin." The end of quote. By paying for their interests with the lives of contemporary aborigines, that is, the Ukrainians, the West, headed by the United States, in the best new colonial traditions, is trying to find solutions to its geopolitical tasks and to make sure that Washington doesn't lose its self-appointed role as a global policeman, and not to see other powerful and self-sufficient poles emerge in the world. Whatever happens, it's become clear that in this proxy war, the United States, EU, and NATO against Russia, by using the hands of the Ukrainians, Ukraine is losing. And what is no less important, no matter how difficult it'll be to accept this conclusion for our European colleagues, Ukraine is not the only one who is losing from this conflict. Perhaps the most important loser is the European Union itself. Taking this opportunity, I'd like to address the representatives of the European Union. You, for such a long time, you built the European project. You were proud that you managed to mold common foreign policy and common security policy. We remember the times when the European Union nurtured plans for its own independent geopolitical role, had its own opinion for a whole range of key international issues. It's incredible how quickly you've given up all these ambitions. As soon as the order came, you got back into line as obedient satellites of the United States. The conflict in Ukraine, which you are so diligently stoking by scraping the bottom of the European arsenals for any remaining weaponry, is only worsening migration problems in your country and is undermining your energy sector. As we learned this week, the direct losses of just Germany, which is considered the locomotive of the EU, due to the anti-Russian sanctions imposed by the United States, is at least $200 billion. So where is the European interest in this? It's unfortunate that you have forgotten that the U.S. and Great Britain have always been the main beneficiaries of any conflict on the territory of continental Europe. They intentionally stoked conflicts in this region so as not to allow for the emergence of another geopolitical competitor, that is a unified Europe living in peace and cooperation with its neighbor Russia. You've consistently, through the efforts of new European members who are promoting EU interests, you've been introduced to poison of Russophobia and have been poisoned. And today, instead of strategic partnership and mutually beneficial economic projects, you're depicting Russia as an enemy, and you're shooting yourself in the foot by supposedly freeing yourself from energy dependency on our country while becoming even more dependent on falling into a harsher dependence on the United States. Furthermore, not only Ukraine, but all of Europe risks becoming a theater of a military confrontation, which you're being drawn into from across the ocean. Do the people of Europe really need this? I'd like to believe that they don't. Opinion polls conducted in January in 12 European countries show that only 10% of Europeans believe that Ukraine can defeat Russia. European farmers are rebelling. They don't want to lose agricultural markets due to the dumping by Ukrainian exporters. There's been widely viewed footage of scandals on the Polish-Ukrainian border where Polish border guards refuse to allow Ukrainian trucks with grain. It's clear that there will be no European future for the completely corrupt and criminalized Ukraine with its dirt-poor inhabitants. A country that was once the breadbasket of the Soviet Union but has completely been destroyed by its puppet government. Because Ukraine, since it became formally independent, was to play the role of an anti-Russian bridgehead. In 2004, what occurred was the first staged Western anti-constitutional coup, which ultimately the people of Ukraine did not support. Then the West began to plan its coup in such a way that there would be no more misfires in order to destroy once and for all the patriotically oriented opposition. This is precisely what has been going on since the Maidan coup of 2014. Now, the neo-nationalists and neo-Nazis that came to power in 2014 with the support of the West, this represented a watershed in the recent history of Ukraine. The anti-constitutional coup d'etat, whose 10th year anniversary we are witnessing today, became possible as a result of an unconcealed interference into the internal affairs of this country. Thus spelled the beginning of drawing Kiev into its dangerous gambles meant to inflict a strategic defeat against Russia, thus taking the path of ignoring the interests of its people and trampling on the rights of the inhabitants of the southeast. These people merely sought to preserve their identity, their historical and cultural roots. Against them, a cruel and inhumane anti-terrorist operation was launched. And during that operation, in breach of the Constitution of Ukraine, the army and national battalions were deployed. Nationalist battalions were deployed. There were no terrorists in the Donbass, which was confirmed in its recent decision by the International Court of Justice. All this has led to the deterioration of Ukrainian statehood, further radicalization, growth in nationalism, and multiple victims among the peaceful population. The representative the representative of the British stated that aren't asked us whether we fear or we regret sending our sons to fight in Ukraine. Of course, we regret this very much. We also pity the poor Ukrainians who are sent to die to further the interests of the West. Only the representative of Great Britain hypocritically forgot to mention that we did this. We sent our boys to fight 2 years ago, not to start a war, but to prevent a war. To finish it, rather. To end a war, which was conducted by 8 years by a regime that was supported by you, a war against the Donbass. By that time, already 14,000 people had become victims of that war. That was the main reason for the start of the special military operation. As far as the issue of who we're fighting in Ukraine, well, you can answer that question yourself if you recall that the Kiev regime extols as its heroes. For example, Bandera and Shukhevich, whose their regiments and units, together with the SS and Nazis, killed hundreds of thousands of Poles and Ukrainians. Or ask Mr. Sikorsky, who will take the floor later, and he'll tell you about the Volyn massacre by the Ukrainian army and how it is remembered in Poland. We believe that if leaders of a country glorify Nazis, speak like Nazis, and allow for the demonstrations using Nazi symbols, they are Nazis. You are simply too cowardly and too myopic to acknowledge all this. Once again, using the presence of Mr. Séjourné and Mr. Cameron today, who left the room. Unfortunately, neither of them is in the room now. I would like to raise another quite uncomfortable, has been uncomfortable issue for our Western colleagues. That is the Minsk agreements. About a year ago, we all heard the admission of Petro Poroshenko, Francois Hollande, Angela Merkel, as well as Boris Johnson, about the fact that neither France nor Germany, not even Great Britain, never took these agreements seriously. And they did not intend to encourage the Ukrainian authorities to fulfill them. They simply used them to give Kiev time to prepare for war with Russia. This, in essence, was an admission of guilt by the leaders of these states, openly and even proudly acknowledging how they intentionally violated Resolution 2202 of the Security Council, which endorsed the Minsk agreements. That does not prevent the representatives of these states, as though none of that happened, to speak today with lectures and lecture other members about the importance of complying with international law and violating resolutions of the Security Council. Rather, they call for the respect of an international rules-based order, based on rules which they themselves invented for their own benefit. All these years since the signature of the Minsk agreements, the Kiev regime continued its military preparations, strengthening its military potential of the Ukrainian armed forces, stepped up its military cooperation with foreign states. Only after all attempts to convince the Ukrainians, as well as its Western sponsors, to implement in good faith and fully the fundamental document for resolving the Ukrainian conflict, the package of measures of the Minsk agreements. Only once all these attempts proved to be in vain was the decision made to begin a special military operation to protect the lives of the inhabitants of Donbass in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. Madam President, today our American colleague trying to find new reasons to criticize or to attack Russia mentioned that Alexei Navalny, who was convicted based on actual accusations, died in prison. Can you tell me then for what reason the Ukrainian regime killed Gonzalo Lira in prison? You didn't do anything to prevent that. You didn't mention anything of that or any of the other crimes committed by the Kiev regime. Distinguished colleagues, any conflict ends sooner or later. There's no doubt that the Ukrainian conflict will end as well. There's no doubt that the longer it lasts, due to the sustained support by the West, the less advantageous will be the peace conditions for Ukraine. In the long run, what will be important is what kind of conclusions the West will draw from this. Will it continue with suicidal stubbornness to impose on the rest of the world its one-sided rules-based order, but trying to divide the world into satellites and enemies, or will it engage in meaningful dialogue to find a way to build a truly just world order where the interests of all states will be guaranteed? For now, we have to note with regret that Europe is in the throes of strategic blindness. It sees the architecture of Euro-Atlantic security through the sight of a weapon, fueling its own fears about the Russian threat against which it needs to defend itself, while denying to Russia its own legitimate defense interests. This is a short-sighted and flawed approach which undermines the basic principles of the indivisibility of security. You're stoking laughable fears about the supposed upcoming aggression of Russia against European countries. Perhaps you have forgotten that it was European states at different historical periods, Poland, Sweden, France, Germany, and a whole range of its satellites, almost all of Europe during World War II, attacked the Russian state with remarkable single-mindedness, trying to defeat it, and always unsuccessfully. The United States tried to do the same thing during the Cold War. It's well known the disreputable role of Great Britain. Its diplomacy was always sophisticated in pitting countries against each other and pitting nations against each other, and continues to do so. The Russian statehood was shaped in conditions of constant external threats. Our peace-loving Western colleagues don't like to remember the fact that it was Russia who had always had to beat back aggressions. But our people remember that very well. We know that this anti-Russian propaganda against the mythical Russian threat is believed less and less by the public in Western countries. That is why it is being wrapped up in layers of lies in order to not allow the truth through. But it has gotten through anyway, thanks to the efforts of those who understand what the world risks by continued confrontation. When there are such information breakthroughs, such as the one that took place during the interview by the American journalist Tucker Carlson, whose interview with the president of Russia opened the eyes of millions around the world. Now, beyond today's moment, it increasingly becomes necessary to discuss a fair and indivisible system of Euro-Atlantic security. In its current distorted version, it only is in the interest of the United States and its allies in NATO, which adopted the right to interfere in international affairs and to international affairs of other states. Western leaders fooled us during the years of the Cold War and want to continue to fool us now. They consider the rights of NATO to continue to expand as an absolute right, and transforming any corner of the world into the area of responsibility of the alliance. I want to just recall that Russia proposed a substantive dialogue on security guarantees at the end of 2021 and put forward specific proposals to the U.S. and NATO, but they were arrogantly rejected. The result was a new hot conflict in Europe. The West left us no choice. We were forced to defend our people and our future. At the same time, we never refused negotiations. The Kiev regime itself refused itself to engage in negotiations. I want to stress it is still possible to maintain Ukraine in some kind of form, but it must be a peaceful, neutral Ukraine with which there are no discriminations against or Russophobia, and where Nazi criminals are not glorified and which does not represent a threat to Russia. That is the goal of our special military operation. This is why the choice by the collective West will be necessary. They will need to find some common sense in order to save something from Ukraine.